Hey noobs, uh, for this video I just wanted to go over the basic layout of an engine. As you can see, I have drawn here a very crude engine diagram, and I've labeled it with the most basic of parts. And I just wanted to show, I guess you can say, the anatomy, the basic anatomy of an engine, of this cross section of an engine, and talk a little bit about what the parts do and etc. I won't go into too much detail, as this drawing doesn't really allow me for such detail. And yeah, I guess in later videos I'll explain a lot more. There's a bunch of things here that, of course, I haven't drawn in. I didn't draw in, for example, any injection. Like the injectors can be like outside of the port, outside of the drawings. This is obviously not a direct injection engine. As you can see, it's a dual overhead cam, so no push rods, nothing like that. So, I mean, yeah, let's just, get into it, I guess. So down here, at number one, we basically have what would be called the crankcase, which it could be considered part of the engine block, but we have what we could call the crankcase, and sort of united with the oil pan. I didn't separate those in this drawing. Here we have like the oil line. So as the counterweight, this is the crankshaft counterbalance, right? As it spins, it sinks a little bit into that oil and splashes oil all over the bottom part of the engine, all over the internal parts of the crankcase, etc. Then here we have, your crankshaft along with this part here. This could be like the other, another main main journal of the crankshaft, if you imagine it behind where this drawing is and forward, So it's like your main journal that connects to your connecting rod, right? And there's be bearings right here, like between here. Those, like, they're like slit bearings, and then just like, right? And then here we skip up here, cut out all the crap out because, I was running out of space. I put most of the effort on the cylinder head, as you can tell. So in here we continue with the connecting rod. And here we have this black part that would be the wrist pin. So here we have the connecting rod, right? And then through there goes like a tube that's literally just what we call the wrist pin. And if you can imagine this piston just cut out like this, but in reality it goes like that around, right? So it'll be like metal like this, and there's that hole here where you put the wrist pin, and the wrist pin connects the piston to the connecting rod. And this, as you can tell, is a piston, right? Or the cross section of the piston. And if we go, right here would be the this is still the engine block. This part right here you can tell number 10 is the combustion chamber, this entire thing right here. And right here we have the piston, and you can tell that the piston, I purposely drew it so it doesn't make contact with the walls of the engine block, because in reality, you have tolerances that are, I think millimeters of millimeters, like little tiny millimeters, and these tolerances don't, like, your piston doesn't really touch the wall. So here, these two orange little things, if you can imagine, they go around the piston, right? So this is just the cross section. Those is what we call the compression rings. This top one right here is very important because that's what we call the top compression ring. And there's usually more. There's usually like 2 to 4 compression rings. You also have like expansion rings, and you have usually 1, 2, 3 oil control rings, which is number 9 right here at the bottom. Right here, that's the oil control ring, my bad. So basically what the compression rings do, as the name suggests, they kind of fill that gap. They keep that gap filled if need be, because the cylinder does, the piston sort of just, moves like this a little bit within the wall, If you have too much, you have like knock and stuff like that, but those compression rings, as the name suggests, keep compression, they prevent any gases and exhaust and stuff from, breaking through this little gap down into down into the crankshaft cover and etc. and the crankcase and stuff. And then this little gap right here that you can see on both sides of the piston. So this is a piston that has what we call a heat damp. So that little, if you can imagine, let me switch hands. I'm getting a little tired. If you can imagine, you know, the heat of combustion, you know, spreading throughout the top of the piston. So there's all this metal starts heating up. To keep your top compression ring from receiving all that heat and expanding prematurely, because that's a very common cause of engine failures when your rings have like this little gap, right? Imagine, again, it goes around the piston. So they have this little gap. What happens when metal heats? It expands. So if you overheat your engine, what can happen is that that gap just closes until the metal literally goes like that. And then that, you know, the tolerances between the piston and the wall are not enough to allow for that. So it literally just breaks off. And then those little pieces, you know, cause mayhem either in the combustion chamber or go down and then get sucked up by your oil system and stuff. And then that's not good. You don't want those little tiny pieces of metal flowing throughout either in the combustion chamber or anywhere else in the engine. Your oil control ring, pretty much. So if you can imagine everything down here, you know, all these walls right here, the bottom of your piston itself, because your piston also has like little tiny holes on it. It might have to allow for oil to flow in and out right through this bottom part right here. And then, you know, all of this is lubricated in oil, whatever. So what this ring does is that it's built in a way that it kind of scrapes the wall, right, as it moves up and down. So it pulls down any oil that might, so imagine this is further up. If there's oil here and the piston's higher up, that oil control ring will scrape all the way down and scrape down the oil back down to the oil line, whatever, to the oil pan. And again, I didn't draw the oil system, whatever, but basically your oil, your pump will suck up from here, and it will basically pump oil throughout, you know, throughout your engine, including through little holes in your crankshaft. And it'll just pump it through like oil galleries and such throughout the entire block, the cylinder head, all the way up to the valves, whatever. You know, same thing applies sort of for the cooling system. There's like these little pockets in your engine, in your head, and your engine block that are called water, like water bubbles, water packs, etc. Like little like holes where the coolant can kind of get in there and then draw out the heat and then be forced out through another like cooling passage or cooling gallery, etc. And you know, your oil doesn't, you know, it's not only, its job not only is to lubricate, but it's to maintain a good sort of range of operating temperature, right? So if your oil heats up and is heated to its operational temperature, if the temperature outside is colder, it'll keep, you know, that oil helps to keep, along with your cooling system and the heater, to keep your engine in a good operating temperature. And the opposite is also true. Your oil can also help in cooling your engine if it's overheating. But at that point you have other issues, you know. And it also lubricates, again, it prevents friction, so it prevents specific points of friction from acquiring too much heat. So your oil also works to control and maintain a stable temperature in your engine. So is here number 11, what I have labeled number 11 is your fuel air charge, your mixture. So if you can see that blue, that's your air, right? And then all that orange, those little dots would be the atomized fuel, the atomized gasoline. This is a gasoline engine, as you can see, because it has a spark plug. Diesel engines do not have spark plugs. They rely on their high compressions to cause ignition. So right there is your spark plug, that brown thing. Right there's your spark plug gap, number 12, along with the spark, the little spark it created, and it ignites the fuel. So your fuel does not explode. It does not detonate. Your fuel air mixture deflagrates, meaning a very fast and stable burn. right? So you want, in your engine, you want this flame front to start spreading out, you know, like you imagine this rest of the chamber is filled with the charge. You want it to evenly, slowly spread out and slowly release all its energy as it pushes the piston down. You don't want detonation, or, you know, what you can call knock, premature ignition, etc. Because if this fuel charge detonates, if it just, you know, literally explodes way too fast, it'll release all of its energy before the piston has, you know, has gone all the way down, or even gone through its travel. So you're basically wasting all that extra energy there if it just detonates. You want to evenly burn, and that even combustion will also ensure that you burn up most of the fuel that you have. Here we can see the different valves in different colors. So we have, in blue, we have the intake valve, along with what I labeled 16, which would be the intake port. And then we have the red valve, which would be the exhaust valve with the exhaust port. This long thing here in blue, it's the ignition coil, along with quote unquote the ignition pack. They're not interchangeable, but for now, for this purpose, I'll say they're interchangeable. Not all engines have like engine packs, I think. I don't remember. Some of them don't even have it like on top here. Like, this is just, you know, an exaggeration, whatever. Here in the valves, we have these green parts, and those are your valve spring keepers and washers. And you can see the spring right there. Those are the valve springs. That's what, you know, pushes the valve back up. This part right here, from here up, is what you would call your cylinder head. Usually your cylinder head makes up a slight portion of the top of your combustion chamber, or it literally just makes up the top, like the top part like that. This is where your valve train is at. Your valve train is anything from your valves all the way up to your camshafts and their timing components. So here, that bit in orange that's like rounded at the top, that's what you call your valve lifter. Again, this is not a push rod engine. Maybe I'll get to that in a later part of the video with another drawing, but these are just responsible for transmitting the motion of your cams down into the valves like that. They have other purposes, etc. They help do certain things, but we won't get into that right now. You have those little weird things looking right there and like kind of pink. Those are your cam lobes, my bad. And you can tell that, first of all, you can tell both of these are closed because that little part that juts out from your lobe is not pushing down on the lifter, which is not pushing down on either valve. Therefore, you can tell that this engine is in some phase of compression and power, meaning this piston is probably reaching the top of its travel, compressing this fuel mixture, and the spark is igniting, starting the power stroke. Hence why both valves are closed. And you can tell they're also offset from each other. You can tell that if this is indeed the start of the power stroke, as it travels down and it starts pushing back up, this valve is going to open next, which is the exhaust valve, meaning any exhaust gases from this combustion will leave through the exhaust port. These little parts that cover, like this little box right here, is what we can call, you know, your valve covers, which is, you know, just basically that's like the little top part that sits on top of your cylinder head, and you can just remove that and you'll easily be able to see your camshafts, and you'll be able to see your lifters and such. That little purple part right there is the camshaft itself. Again, none of this is drawn to scale, as you can see. So what's the cool thing and the beauty about the internal combustion engine? Well, what I find pretty cool about it, amongst many other aspects, is that it converts the linear motion, right? So the up and down travel of the piston and via the connecting rod into rotational motion of the crankshaft. That's we don't really think about it, but that's pretty damn cool. And we can get into timing and everything just on a superficial basis. So this crankshaft, your crank, will extend out through the engine block, not completely, but it will extend out, connecting to what's called a flywheel, which is basically, it's just like, let's say, a very heavy wheel of metal, relatively speaking, to all the other parts. It has a lot of mass, and with a lot of mass, it better conserves its momentum. So yeah, it's hard to spin it up at first, but once you get that mass spinning and you let go of the throttle, your engine just doesn't suddenly like just bog down and your car just like, like, it's a very smooth drop. It's a very smooth drop, and that's because that flywheel has mass and it takes longer to slow down. So you have that flywheel, right? And that goes out to your transmission. On the other end, you usually have your crank pulley, which is literally just a pulley sticking out through the crank. And you have either a chain, which they don't really use anymore, just like timing gears, they're really obsolete. And most cars nowadays use damn, I'm getting a brain fart, my bad, guys. Like a rubber, well, it's a very tough rubber with little like metal linings inside of it. Your belt, my bad, guys, it's your timing belt. So through that big crank pulley, you got your timing belt, and then that would go up, in this case, because it's a dual overhead cam, it'll go up to other pulleys, or actually they're kind of like gears, they're tooth gears and stuff that stick out in the same manner through your cams. Through your cams, like the gear would stick out through here, right under both, like that. And they're usually set up in a way that, let's say, for example, for every one rotation of this blue part of your crank, you get 2 rotations of your cams, let's say. And of course, those 2 rotations are offset, let's say, by 180 degrees. I don't know, just some random number like that, just to make sure that your valves open when they don't open it, for example, at the same time. They open offset from each other, right? So your timing, pretty much as it sounds, it times when this piston is going through its cycle. So what do I mean by cycle? Well, we have what we call 4 strokes. Oh, this is gonna be tricky. All right, let me switch pen. Not bad, guys. It's gonna be tricky looking through the phone and doing this at the same time, but we'll manage. One way to classify engines is to classify them by their strokes. You have your 2-stroke engines and you have your 4-stroke engines. All modern vehicles have 4-stroke engines, including diesel engines. Even rotary engines could fall down into the 4-stroke cycle. Ooh, this is tricky. So your 4 strokes, you have, damn, my bad. You have your intake stroke, then you have your compression stroke, right? Then you have your power or combustion, whatever you want to call it, power, combustion, stroke, or whatever. And then you have exhaust. Right? Notice that every piston, every cylinder in your engine goes through these 4 phases, you could say. And out of those 4 phases, you're only making power through one of them, right? So a quarter of the time, your cylinder, your piston, is actually not producing any power, right? So you have your intake stroke. During your intake stroke, just picture that your piston is at what we call top dead center, is at the highest it could travel, at its highest compression, right? We can say that it would be somewhere, let's say around here, right? So imagine both valves are closed. As your crankshaft rotates, keeps rotating, and pulls down the connecting rod, it pulls down your piston. But that creates a vacuum, right? Because if now you all of a sudden have more volume, but you have nothing filling up that volume, you're creating a vacuum. You're creating, you know, a differential in pressure. So there's pressure and pressure as this goes down. There's pressure. Fuck, my bad, guys. There's pressure in here trying to suck anything, try to pull on anything. And through timing, that is when mechanically this little lobe pushes down on this, compresses this spring as it pushes down this valve. As that happens, off of the picture, there's going to be an injector that injects a certain amount of atomized gas along with air. Assuming we're talking about naturally aspirated. So this engine has nothing pushing in extra air outside of that pressure, that vacuum, right? And, you know, assuming you're driving forward and your intake is like this, you know, you might have air rushing in, but whatever. So you have that spray. And when that opens, that vacuum will suck in that fuel air charge, right? And then your piston travels down, let's say to around somewhere here, let's say, right? That's what we call bottom dead center. So you have bottom dead center, and then you have up here top dead center, and we abbreviate them as such. So a little quick thing, the volume of your cylinder is calculated when your piston is all the way at bottom dead center. That would be the volume of your cylinder. If every one of your cylinders has, let's say, what could be, let's say 0.5 liters, right, of total volume, and you have a 4-cylinder engine, you have a 2-liter engine. That's what that means when you see, you know, your 2-liter engine, whatever, or you have a 454 engine, it means 454 cubic inches, etc. And then you have, I'm sure you've heard of this before, you have your compression ratio. So your compression ratio is pretty much, let's see, guys. Let's say, okay, so let's say at bottom dead center, right? At bottom dead center, your volume per cylinder is 0.5 liters. And let's say that at top dead center, and again, these are not actual numbers from an actual engine, you know, making stuff simple, is 0 to 1 liters. That means that your ratio, right, the ratio of the volume at top dead center is 1, and then what is it, volume, oh my bad, and then the volume at bottom dead center, 5. So you have a 1 to 5 compression ratio, meaning that when you're at top dead center, this little area right here, this little volume right here, my bad, is 5 times smaller than if you were at bottom dead center of the entire cylinder. You know, you have compression ratios, I think, you know, for most modern cars, most modern sedans, something like 1 or 1.8 to 1.9, whatever. And then you start getting into like the 1.12s, you know, I think diesel is like as low as like the lowest of diesel is 14.5, or that might be like the highest of like sports cars and such. But yeah, that's your, you know, your compression ratios. And to just get that out the way, let's talk about fuel octane rating. People have a misconception that octane actually makes your gas more powerful or makes your engine run better or whatever, etc. And It doesn't work like that, right? What happens is that when you compress something, especially a fluid, in this case the gases of your air and the atomized fuel, when you compress that fluid, an increase in that pressure is directly related to an increase in temperature, right? So if you have a certain compression ratio, when that fuel mixture is compressed, its temperature rises. And if you have just pure gasoline with no octane, that compression ratio is enough, that compression is enough to generate enough heat to ignite that fuel even before your piston gets anywhere near what it's supposed to be when when good detonation occurs or combustion, right? So what happens is that octane actually is not volatile. Like, it's not a volatile, it's not like, it resists ignition, right? It helps gasoline have a higher ignition temperature. Therefore, it won't detonate prematurely. That's why if you have like a sports car, let's say, even like a decent middle of the road, whatever, BMW, Mercedes, whatever, they will tell you, hey, only put, premium gas, only put like the 97 gas, whatever, because you need that octane, that higher octane rating, because usually those engines will have a higher compression ratio, meaning that if you put the lowest gas that you can get, you might not right away notice any issues, but your fuel can start and can begin to ignite prematurely. You start getting knock, etc. If you get knock, you might get like this part right here of the fuel charge ignite so much, like reach such a temperature that it ignites apart from the rest, and that can cause an uneven pressure on your piston, and it can go like that, like knock literally hit the side of the engine, and stuff like that. That's not good. Basically that's how diesel engines actually work. Diesel relies on that really high, that maybe like the 1 to 14.5 compression ratio. It relies on that compression, that very high compression, to make that diesel reach a temperature where it ignites by itself. That's why they don't have spark plugs, right? So, we got that out the way. We're back to the intake stroke. So as that piston starts moving down, draws all that air in, and then before the piston starts to move back up, through the timing, through that belt and the spinning, whatever, this little lobe will move out to, for example, the state that is now, and the valve will close thanks to the valve spring. So now we have it sealed, right? And your piston is moving up. And real quick, we have something that's called Atkinson's engine cycle, whatever. It's not really any different than your basic engine layout. I think it's called the Otto cycle. Your Atkinson cycle pretty much just allows for this intake valve to be open a little longer as the piston's coming up. So then that forces some of this fuel air mixture to draw out. There's advantages to it, believe it or not. It sounds counterintuitive, but it actually increases efficiency at a cost of reducing power. So as the piston starts moving up, you enter your compression stroke, right? As the name suggests, you're now compressing this mixture. That's it, right? So usually right before, a few degrees before your piston reaches top dead center, so like right about now, a little bit around where that 10 would be as it's coming up, the spark plug, shoots a jolt of electricity that, jumps that little gap through the electrodes and starts that little, ignition. And then, so that's the beginning of your power stroke, or your combustion stroke, your ignition stroke, whatever you want to call it. Mainly it's called the power stroke. So now this whole thing is igniting as your cylinder's already reaching top dead center. meaning that it's being starting to push back down, right? Because this combustion is changing, it's chemically changing these fluids, and these exhaust gases are actually going to be more dense. And not just that, but they're kinetically being, actually moved through the burning of the fuel. So that pushes, right, your piston down, and this linear motion gets converted into a rotational motion of the crankshaft. I didn't draw it good here, but your crankshaft is literally looks like this, sort of like, right? So if we have this part, this would be, let's say, your flywheel. You have, for example, like stuff like this, then you have the connecting rod, whatever, and then, they're all offset, right? And like, for example, this one is not necessarily have to be online with this one, and they're all offset, and that offset is what, is what helps that piston to, that connecting rod to go like that, to just go from here to here, and then keep rotating, and then come back up like that. I don't know if it makes any sense. I'm just eating shit. But yeah, right? Like, it's not just rotating like this, right? It's offset. It's kind of hard to draw, but like, it's offset, like that. And then here would be where your next connecting rod would be, right? So it's really hard to draw, but it is offset, and that's why the thing can actually spin like that, right? Like that, rather than just, because if you just have it right here on the same line, that linear force coming down is not going to do anything. It's not going to spin it. It's going to break it because it's in the same line like this, right? But now if you have that little part offset like this from the axis of rotation, from that center line, maybe here, when that connecting rod starts moving down, it goes off to the side like that. And that's what allows that center axis to start rotating. Right? So that's your power stroke. Now, when you start coming right back up through the timing belt and such, now this valve, the exhaust valve, opens up. And as it compresses, it pushes your exhaust gases through your exhaust port. So those are the four basic phases or strokes: your intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust, or your power stroke. And it'll usually look something like for example, if you have let me make sure. Let me see. Yeah, if you have 360 degrees, right, a full circle. Imagine that this full circle is a rotation of your crankshaft, right? 360 degrees. Right, let me erase this. So it might look something like this, yeah. Again, these are not actual numbers, it's just to show. During these first 90 degrees, you have intake. Then during this other 90 degrees, you have compression. And then another 90, you have power. And then you have exhaust. Notice that intake and exhaust do not occur independently of each other. Meaning, I'm not saying that both valves are open at the same time. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that this piston pushes up, and the ending, right? Like we see here, the end of your exhaust stroke is the same beginning of your intake stroke, right? And you also got to be aware that, for example, let's say you have a 3-cylinder engine, which do exist. You got 3 cylinders, you got 5-cylinder engines, right? So you can have something like this. Your first piston right? You see there's a little space here. Your first piston can be on the compression stroke, right? Starting the power stroke. Meanwhile, over here, you can have a piston down here, right? From here, all this space. This could be, well, it could be many things. It could be its intake stroke, right? Or it could be in the beginning of its compression stroke, right? And then you have this other one here. Also look at that short little space. This one should most definitely be in its exhaust stroke, right? So they're all offset from each other. So if you can imagine, if each of these faces is offset from each other by 90 degrees, each of the cylinders in your engine are also offset a certain amount, right? So if we can see this one, let's say this one is, let's say this one is right here, right? Let's jot that as 180 degrees. Because everything in timing is measured in degrees. You know, you'd be like, your piston is at 90 degrees. No, too much, my bad. Your piston is at 23 degrees before top dead center. So they would be like, your piston is at 23 degrees before top dead center. BTDC, before top dead center, right? Just so you know. Timing is measured entirely in like degrees. So let's say piston number 1 is at 180 degrees, right? Right here. Piston number 2, number 3 is at approaching 360 degrees, which is equal to 0 degrees. It's approaching. It's not there yet, right? So these two are offset, right, quite clearly by 180 degrees. More or less 180 degrees. And this one is just fucking in the middle, right? So then, you know, my bad, guys. Didn't mean to get my finger in the way. So then, for 4-cylinder engines, you usually have, you know, something the same. You know, they're all kind of offset. They can all be offset by 90 degrees. But you usually have 2 pistons in the same sort of location in the engine, right? There's another thing I didn't draw in the drawing. It's like the not the counterbalance, the balance shaft. You know, there's a shaft that helps reduce certain vibrations in the crank and stuff for a smoother ride. And I know this doesn't look like it, but if you can picture cylinder 1 or piston 1, right, 1 through 4, you can tell that 2 and 3 and 1 and 4 respectively are at the same physical location, right, at the same level. They might not actually be in the same phase or the same stroke. They could be, but they're physically in the same, at the same altitude, at the same level, whatever. Feel me? Or it could also be like this. And that's where you get stuff like, I think it's called cross plane, flat plane, whatever. I don't know the exact terminology right now, but it's sort of like, you know, it has different names, different designations. You can also have this layout. Shit, my bad. Right? And all this is to help counter like harmonic vibrations, you know, harmonic frequencies, if you can call them that. So what I mean by that is that, right, so picture you have, you know, your cylinders, whatever. All of this is causing vibrations within your engine. So if we can imagine this wave, you know, it's a vibration, right? If this wave all of a sudden meets, well, not from here, but like if this wave is added to a wave that is similar, well, it doesn't have to be, that is similar in like frequency, right? But for example, let's say it's a lot bigger, right? I'm not going to get into math too much, but let's say this has 10 hertz of frequency and this one also has 10 hertz. Just this one has a lot more amplitude, as we can see. If these are the vibrations in your engine, right, this actually adds It adds up. It's constructive. So your resulting frequency or your wave, I don't know, I don't remember necessarily if it's going to be just the additive of these frequencies, but your wave is now going to be hella bigger, right? So that's like, for example, I don't know if you've ever seen in a guitar, if you hold down a certain string, for example, let's say you hold down the E string on the 5th fret, you have an A note, right? And if you hit it hard enough, or if you have an amp and you're close to the amp and you hit that hard enough, you can see that your open A string, the string below that, might be oscillating a little bit, or a lot actually, right? Because that frequency is the, I think it's called the resonant frequency of the other string. So now if you have this little wave with a certain frequency and there's parts within your engine that will also start vibrating at this certain frequency, then this wave will cause other parts to start vibrating, and then they start kind of adding up into bigger and bigger waves, and that's when you start getting like vibrations and stuff within your engine. Now you also have the opposite. You have destructive interference, which if you take a wave, I think it works like this. So if you have a wave and you have a wave of the exact, let's just keep it exact, of the exact amplitude, right? Of the same height, right? From here to here, right? Of the same height, but they're offset, right? So let me see. So imagine it's like here, like, fuck. Something like, I did it wrong. Oh, it's like this. Imagine if it's something like this, right? So when this part comes down, this part comes up. When this part comes up, this part comes down. When these two waves meet, since they're the same like wave, like amplitude wise, but they're like mirror images of each other, they cancel each other out. And pretty much that would end a vibration, right? So that's pretty much what these designs I showed you before try to do. They try to reduce all these frequencies created by vibrations and such. They try to reduce those, minimize those. You have your counterbalances to keep everything nice and balanced, nice and steady, reduce vibrations. You have what I told you before, you have that that balance shaft that can go, that's like on your crank like that, and it just helps balance and reduce vibrations in your engine. So yeah, that has been a very crude, very basic explanation, layout of an engine. There's of course a lot other things I could have gone into, it's just, there's so much I can do with a drawing. But yeah, this is the most basic anatomy of an engine. So hope you enjoyed, maybe learned a few little parts. Of course, there's a lot more parts than this. Again, you have your gaskets, etc. You have your push rods. Your push rods engines are amazing. People talk crap about them, but they're pretty good. They're great. They're old, but they're good. Old technology is good. Look at the Ellis engines. Ellis engines are push rods engines. I'll get into that maybe later. Maybe I'll come another drawing, whatever. Also, I didn't cover different head designs. For example, this is what is called an I head design. You have other engines where, for example, you have your valves actually here on the side, and then you have your block, whatever, your engine block, and then here's your combustion chamber. But your air, like this, opens through here and it kind of comes in through here like that. LS engines, if I'm not mistaken, are like this. I don't remember exactly, but they're like that. Like the valves would be like on the side here, right? Those I think are called, you have your T heads. I think that's when you have like both on both sides like that. Then you have I think it's your F head or something like that, where you also have like intake and exhaust on the side, but they're like on the same side. So there's different head designs, etc. This, what you see here is, as you can see, a gasoline dual overhead cam I head engine. There's many more classifications of engines. There's okay, so the fuel they use, cam position, like where it's at, layout, number of pistons, volume, just design itself. You have rotaries or Wankel engines. So yeah, there's actually strokes, right? So fuel, you could have, you know, fucking electric vehicles, and they're different, but you can have gasoline, diesel, and you have your cam positions, dual overhead, single overhead, whatever, overhead cam, you know. You can have your push rods, you can have your layout, which would be inline, V's, W's, flats, and you have your number of pistons, you know. It's not the same saying an inline 4 as a V4, inline 6 as a V6. Then you have your volume, you know. It's not the same thing saying a 2 liter, not V6, 2 liter inline 4 as saying something crazy like a 5 liter inline 4. It's, you know, that's another different way to classify them. You have rotary engines. I'm not going to get into that. I'll explain the Dorito some other day. You have your strokes, you know, 2-stroke, as we just talked about this one, the 4-stroke engines, cycles. You have the auto. I got that into the auto, and then you have the what is it that I called it? The Atkinson cycle, etc. Feel me? So there's many ways to classify an engine, and yeah, peace.